So today we are very happy to have with us Dr. Connor-Linton Polio, who will facilitate our discussion on balancing language and content in writing classes. Just to introduce Charlene, she is professor and associate chair in the Department of Linguistics and Languages at Michigan State University. She teaches in the MA program in TESOL and the PhD program in Second Language Studies there. Her research on second language writing focuses on research methods for second language writing and interface between second language acquisition and second language writing. She is currently the co-editor of the Modern Language Journal, and in January 2018 she will begin a term as the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly. Her book, Understanding, Evaluating, and Conducting Second Language Writing Research, was recently published by Routledge. So we are very happy to have Charlene with us today. And so she will guide our discussion. And the way she has it structured is that she will present, and then we'll have a few opportunities throughout to have discussion. And when we have those discussions, I'd like to encourage everybody to unmute their microphone. So I think everybody's muted by default. But to go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your questions, give your comments. And so we'd like to make this kind of interactive. So do feel free to speak up. You can also type any questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll try to keep track of those and read those out loud. But it's great also if you unmute yourself and contribute orally. Okay? Thank you very much, and I guess we'll turn it over to Charlene.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. This is a totally new genre to me, so I'm not quite sure what to expect. It was a little difficult to think about when I was preparing. In addition, the modality is just sort of fascinating. I've never used this, this particular platform before, so I can sort of see who's here, and then there's a place to look at online comments, and I've got notes on one screen and my slides on another. So if I sound a little distracted, it's because I'm sort of taken in by the modality here, which I'm finding very interesting. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about focusing on language and content in writing classes and the extent to which we should do both of these things. As Ryan mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the interface between SLA and writing. So personally, I'm naturally interested in language development as it occurs in writing classes, but also how writing can help facilitate language development. So this is something I'm always thinking about. But I want to talk a little bit about, what I'm going to do actually is I'm just going to introduce the topic, and then a couple of points I will stop and ask you for your own comments. Let me see if I can advance the screen here. Okay. So one of the things as we're thinking about this is it even possible to teach writing with no language focus? Well, certainly students are always using language when they're writing, but let me show you a couple of examples of activities. So one is this: read your partner's paragraph. What is the main idea? Is that idea supported? Write a paragraph describing a funny story that happened to you. Revise the paragraph and add 5 new details. These are perfectly fine writing activities. There's nothing wrong with them in any way. These are things a lot of us do when we're teaching writing. But you will see that there's no explicit attention drawn to language in either of these activities. Let me give you another example that I see in a lot of reading classes or when I'm observing pre-service teachers is something like this. You're going to read an article about smoking restrictions on college campuses. Answer the following questions first, and then there are a series of sort of schema activating questions that students have to answer before they go ahead and read. But again, there's no focus on any kind of language that will help students understand the passages. And again, there's nothing wrong with any of these things, but again, they don't help give the student language to help them understand the reading passage or to write the paragraphs necessarily. So we can, however, go to the other extreme where you find assignments like this. Write a paragraph using at least 5 different verbs in the past tense. And this is something I think we see a lot of in, I work with foreign language teachers in the U.S. a lot of the time, and this is something you see in a lot of like beginning level Spanish, high school Spanish classes where the students don't have articulated writing needs, so the teacher's just trying to use writing as a way to get students to practice the past tense, but there's no attempt at getting students really to create meaning or to communicate something that they want to communicate. Similarly, you might have a peer activity where they have to look at each other's paragraphs and underline the past tense verbs. Okay? So I think everyone agrees we need both, a focus on language and a focus on idea development or content, but we need to sort of think about how we do both of these things, how we can do them together, and the extent to which we do each of these things. So as we're thinking about this, I want to ask a little bit about context. Does context matter? Well, yeah, of course it matters. We all know that context matters. So as we're thinking about this issue, I want you to think about how it applies to either your own context or another context. So here are a list of some sample contexts, and keeping in mind that in some of these contexts, students really don't have clear writing needs. This happens a lot, particularly in like high school foreign language classes, where in other contexts, such as graduate students in EAP classes who are writing their dissertations, have very clear and articulated writing needs. So before I go on and talk a little bit about some research that I and some others have done, I just want to stop here and see if you have any general questions or comments on this issue. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, and again, we'd like to remind everybody
Okay.
that they feel free to unmute yourself and join in. Speaking for myself, I mean, this is something that I mean, I've always had a tough time finding this balance. I mean, I feel like when I was teaching in an EFL context where students were taking required English classes, I focused a lot more on grammar, and then teaching in intensive English program in the U.S., I think I focus more on not on the language side, on the more rhetorical side, because I felt like students had more of a reason for writing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I guess what my sort of goal is really trying to encourage people who are really focusing only on language, focus on other things, and vice versa. So as part of some research I've been doing, we've been looking at some writing classes, and what we're seeing is a lot of emphasis in some on development, idea development, but very little language focus. So I'm sort of trying to get people to think about how they can sort of combine these better. So I'm looking at I don't see comments, right? I will keep talking then
And sorry, just to jump in, just to remind everybody, just if you want to type your message or your questions or comments too, in the little bar on the right side of the screen, there's a little speech bubble for chat. So if you click on that, it'll take you to the chat window.
One of the Nan said she can't activate her mic because there's too much background noise, but one of the things she says is that she tries to balance both in their IEP. Great. Sometimes it depends on the required textbook. Yeah, I would agree, whether there are language-focused tasks too. Yes, absolutely. Okay, let me go on a little bit and talk about sort of how I why I'm particularly interested in this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done, and again, I'll stop and you can ask questions. But I mentioned before that I'm particularly interested in language development. So I'll start with the bad news, and this is a couple of studies that I've been involved in that have looked at language development over one semester in an EAP. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with there's a special issue of Journal Second Language Writing in 2014 that I co-edited with Jeff Connor-Linton, and we took a data set from, we'll call it the MSU data set, and we looked at language development over the course of the semester. There were several different, everybody looked at the same data set. My particular study looked at accuracy. We looked at a very wide variety of accuracy measures, and what we found was over a semester, except for preposition errors, there was actually very little change over the course of one semester, which was a little bit sad, I think, in some ways, that we didn't see much language change. We also have a study in TESOL Quarterly that's in the 2017 issue that looked at a similar population, and we looked at one semester, and we also, again, using different accuracy measures, even found no change. So it was interesting to us that over a semester there was just no improvement on accuracy measures. If we looked at, Bulte and Hausen also looked at that same data set, and they found no change in any of the vocabulary measures over the course of a semester. In our second study, Yoon Polio, we also found no change in vocabulary. So now we're talking about sort of two different yet similar data sets over the course of a semester in EAP or upper level IEP classes, that we weren't finding any change in sort of these so-called objective measures. If you look at complexity measures, our study found no change over the course of a semester. Bulte and Hausen found a little bit of change over the course of a semester. So if you look at these sort of, again, I guess what we can call objective measures, we're not finding much of a change. However, there was some good news in these essays. First of all, if you used a rubric, which we did as well on the MSU data set, we did find improvement in language, vocabulary, content, and organization. These all increased. It wasn't a huge increase, but it was significant, and there was a decent effect size. And so if we just look at the vocabulary and the language rubrics, we did see an improvement. Students also were able to write more in a certain amount of time, okay, and in both data sets. So both the Journal Second Language Writing data set and then the second data set that we used. But what's even more interesting, and I'm going to stop. I see some of you have questions. I will stop at the end so you can ask questions about the study if you want to hear more about it. But I will also add that there's a really interesting paper in that same issue of Journal Second Language Writing by Eric Friganel and Sarah Weigel, and this is actually a fascinating study, and it's done within the framework of Doug Biber's multidimensional framework. If you don't know a lot about that, don't worry about it for now. I'll just try to explain it. What they did is they looked at groups of features of language. So what they did, here are two sample essays. So the way this research method works, or this data analysis method works, is that by looking at different groups of linguistic features, they find some associated with, in this case, personal opinion versus argumentative discourse. There are other dimensions as well, but this is the one I'm showing you. And so if you look at these two essays, the first one, the personal opinion, this is an essay that had all of the features of an opinion essay, whereas the second one has features of argumentative discourse. And what they found was that over just one semester, students were able to move from the opinion to the argumentative dimension in their writing. And again, this analysis looks only at linguistic features. It's not looking at things like organization or content. So there was some improvement or some change over the course of the semester. So this is sort of fascinating to us, given that we found no changes in accuracy or no changes in, or very few changes in complexity. So I'm going to stop here for a minute and give you a chance to either ask questions on some of the studies, if you have any, but also to think about what does this tell us about how we teach writing. And the way I see it is that we can look at this one of two ways. One is that if students' language is not developing in the short term on certain measures such as accuracy, complexity, vocabulary, do students need more help to improve their language over the course of a semester? Or do we look at it another way? Do we say, look, their language is not really developing if we look at their language in terms of these measures, so we need to stop wasting our time and really focus more on idea development and organization. So I'm going to stop here and have people see if you have questions about the research. And again, the slides are numbered. I can go back and talk about any of the studies in more detail, or we can talk about about these two matters right here on the screen now. Someone asked, one of the questions was about, I think, the nature of these measures. I'm not sure, this is Nan, if you want to reply. I'm not sure if you're talking about the accuracy measures or not, but there's a wide variety of measures. We used about, I think, 8 different ones or so in the 2014 study, and then in the 2017 study we used 3 other measures, and again, we're just not seeing any change.
One thing I was wondering, in the classes that this data comes from, to what extent did those classes focus on grammar and grammatical accuracy?
Got it. I was hoping somebody would ask that question, actually. So I didn't tell you ahead of time to ask that.
No,
That's exactly the kind of question that we should be asking. I just also, before I do that, I just want to mention, Nan also asked about the vocabulary measures. I think we used a measure of lexical sophistication, which was word length. We also looked at diversity, which is a type token ratio. I'm trying to remember, I don't remember what both Danhausen used, but those were the measures we used, so we just didn't find anything. Yeah, going back to your question about what's happening in the classes. Right, after we did this study, and these studies together, the data came from a wide range of classes, mostly upper level, or all upper level actually. So I think it was levels 3 and 4 of an IEP, and then 2 different kinds of EAP classes. And what I'll focus on the EAP classes for now. So we have, where we collected the data, there's 2 different kinds of EAP classes. One called grammar and writing, and the other was just academic writing. And so what we did this past semester was we're trying to conduct a mixed method study that actually goes into the classrooms, talks to the teachers, talks to the students to try to find out, well, why is their language not developing? Is it the teachers don't care about, or the teachers aren't focused on that aspect of writing, that the students don't really care if their writing improves that much? So what we did is we went into the classes. So we looked at we took students from 3 of the classes, and we had them, we interviewed them, we had them compose using, I don't know if anybody's familiar with input log, so they actually compose at the screen, and then we did a stimulated recall. We also observed the classes. And what we found was that in the 2 regular writing classes, there was almost no focus on language, no explicit focus on language in the classes. The teachers did give feedback, they did correct errors, they did give grammatical feedback, but actually in the classes there was almost no focus on language. However, in the class that was called grammar and writing, there was a lot of focus on language. So it really varied. All of the teachers thought that the students needed a language focus, but the curriculum, at least for the one of the writing classes, wasn't set up to include a lot of language focus, whereas in the grammar and writing class, it was set up to include more of a language focus. So I guess to answer your question, it varied a lot. I will say, however, that all of the teachers did give feedback that was related to language on the students' writing. So really, this is what we're trying to understand. We also talked to the students and found that when we asked them, what's your goal for this class? What are you trying to get out of this class? They did all talk about language. We also looked at their revision. I don't have the results off the top of my head from their stimulated recall, but we're also trying to look at how they revise. When they revise, did they revise for language or did they revise for ideas? So this is sort of a study that we're in the middle of, and hopefully we'll be presenting the results at the Second Language Writing Symposium in Thailand.
Just a real quick follow-up. So the two classes, the one that focused more on grammar and the one like grammar and writing, was there any difference in the change in the language measures for that class versus the other class?
Yeah, we haven't looked at. So this was the first two studies I talked about. We didn't link development to the classroom at all. We just threw everybody all together. This semester, the study this past the one that we did this past semester, we are focusing. We asked for student volunteers. They had to come and write at the computer and be interviewed. And unfortunately, the ones that volunteered were from the class where there was much less less grammar focus. So we don't know. So we're trying to think. So we'd like to look at. It would be nice to compare them. However, the students who go into the grammar and writing class they're at a lower level, right? So they're going to be more likely to make language progress than the other students. They're also in class more hours a week. So I don't think we can actually do that comparison. I'm looking at another question. What do we know about how learners' TAF changes over similar time in other circumstances? Well, language focus, of course. So that's an interesting question. Yeah. Do you also find a lack of change if they're just taking some other kind of language course? Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. Other comments or questions? Anybody want to comment on the two statements I have up here on the screen?
I just have a quick comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned, and it says because students' language is not developing in the short term, have any of the studies, tracked students more than a semester?
That's a good question. Yeah, the few that are out there are there's a bunch of cross-sectional studies. So if you look at these cross-sectional studies that track students for a few years, yes, you do see change. So I'm thinking of one particular cross-section. There's a few out there that have done this. There's one cross-sectional study in Journal of Second Language Writing that was done in Europe by Marjolein Verspoor and a bunch of other people. And they looked at, I think, like 60 different, I think there were about 60 different measures or so. And they did find changes in accuracy across the levels. So yeah, so it absolutely, you will see it if you look at a much longer period of time. The problem is it's really hard to do these longitudinal studies for more than one semester.
I'm not going to comment directly to your two situations here on your slide, but I just kind of want to jump in on this idea of, length of time to compare and what we're comparing. And what comes to my mind is just that it feels like measuring each of the, the accuracy measure, the vocabulary measure are discrete, whereas what comes to my mind is, okay, what if we just compare students' papers across a semester? What changes do we see? I think they make much smaller steps in improving their writing, and so it's almost like reverse the question and say, well, what are they improving?
Yeah, well, again, that's what, here, if I go back, I mean, this study by Frigolo and Weigel, I really highly recommend reading this study, because in this case, they're not looking at content organization, they're looking at language. They really are, and yet they did find this change, which is really fascinating. But then also, they did improve, so when we used a rubric, their content score went up, their organization score went up, their vocabulary score went up, their language score went up. Now, the only caveat here is that their essays were longer. And readers can be influenced by length, right? So that could have been, you know, we didn't try to tease these things apart in this study. It could be that these were human assessments, so they could have been influenced by length. In a related study that I did, what we found, again, these are timed essays, so they're sort of like the five-paragraph essay, which we're trying to get away from. But that was, in terms of how to organize that kind of an essay, their scores went up. So students figured that out very quickly, and we all know that's a pretty easy thing to learn. So there definitely was some change. So again, that's the good news. What I think, oh, here's hey Nigel, I'm reading Nigel's comment. I think there's a difference between saying that students aren't making progress on, yes, exactly. I don't know if everyone can see this. So it says, I think that there's a difference between saying that students aren't making progress on specific measures and that students' language is not developing, e.g. cohesion as a function of grammar, so improved organization to me implies growth in language use. Possibly. There are ways to measure cohesion, which we have not done. If you look at Scott Crossley's work, he's done a lot with measuring cohesion, so it would sort of be interesting to see if that improved. At the same time, you see the rater's perception that organization is improving. So yeah, that's a good point, absolutely. Okay, I guess I will move on if nobody else has any questions or comments. And again, I'm going to just talk a little bit about some ideas for focusing on both content and language at the same time. Oh, here, Ryan has a question. I have an idea along with the rubric. What if the instructor provides good models from ESL and EFL learners to analyze? Okay. Yep. I'm gonna oh, it's from a student here. Yeah. Let me. What I'm gonna do. There are all kinds of ways that we can focus on both language and content and ideas at the same time. And so I'm just going to show you 4 of them that I have here, but I think we'll have time where you can sort of chime in with your own ideas. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is if you're focusing on genre or organization or content, you really do want to try to make an attempt to draw students' attention to the language. I haven't really said anything about error correction because I want to get a little bit away from that topic. I know that I did talk a little bit about accuracy. If you look at all these different accuracy measures, we don't see any improvement. But in some ways, that's a little bit of another topic. So I want to focus more on other kinds of language issues that we should address. So I've sort of got 4 different examples for you here, and I've got references. So if you want to read a little bit more about any of these, you can go look at some of these references. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about a Swalesian genre analysis. I mean, there are different kinds of genre analyses we can do with our students. And again, I assume most people are familiar with the work of Swales. And the example I have here is from a journal article. So it's the abstract from a journal article. And this happens to come from Yasuda's article, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this is an example of a journal abstract. And again, most of you are familiar with SLWIS' work, in which you would actually look at a piece of writing and sort of look at what he calls the moves or the steps that are involved in constructing that genre. So you might take this particular genre and go through and say, okay, what are the different parts of it? What is the author trying to communicate in the different parts? So in that sense, you're sort of looking at the organization of the abstract, and usually what you would do is you would compare a bunch of these. But again, SLWIS also talks about looking at the language that's used in these different steps or moves. So in this particular example, what I've done is I've underlined the verbs that follow the subject, this study, or their study. And this is one way teachers can draw students' attention to the language that's actually being used. In this case, we can see 4 different verbs. So the author of this abstract is trying to draw on a range of vocabulary. They're also all in the present tense. There are other things that we could look at with regard to language, but the idea here is that you don't want to focus only on the organization of whatever genre it is you're looking at, but looking at the language that's used to communicate in the different moves or steps. Does anyone have any questions before I go on to another example of some different activities? Stacy said she just did this today. Right, great, great. Summary critique in class today, yep. Okay. So again, it's important to focus on the language. This is the abstract from Yasuda's article, and actually now I'm going to talk about her particular article. I don't know if you guys have read this article, but if you are teaching, this is actually one of my favorite articles out there, and if you're teaching, particularly if you're teaching in a foreign language setting, if we go back to the abstract example, this is the kind of activity a lot of us would use if we were teaching an EAP writing class for students in a English-speaking context that we're going to have to write academic articles or read academic articles as well. However, a lot of you might be saying, oh, I'm teaching a lower level class, in this case, in Yasuda's case, in Japan. So I can't really do this very well. But her article is really nice because she uses the genre of email, and you can see here these are a list of the different lessons that she used when in her class that she was teaching. So she had students throughout the whole semester, they were writing emails, she used models, she looked at the language being used in emails. That's the important part. She looked at the language. So for example, when students were told to write an apology, they looked at different ways that you could apologize. When they were they had to write emails expressing gratitude, they looked at different ways to do this. And if you look at her article, you can see very specific examples of the language that she used. So again, she wasn't focused only on, you know, what goes into an email if you're writing an apology to someone. Now, she certainly did that, but also really did focus on the language as well. Okay. Is everybody any questions so far? The next idea I want to talk about, again, another one of my favorite articles in Journal of Second Language Writing looks at students in an elementary classroom, and this is another type of genre-based writing. This is from the De Oliveri's and Lon's article, which actually comes from Martin and Rose, if you're familiar with that school of genre instruction. But the whole idea is that students look at a text and they sort of take it apart together they construct a text, and then the idea is that the student can eventually do it on their own. Again, there are a lot of articles on this type of genre-based writing, but let me use an example to show you from this particular article. Okay, so the idea is that as students are constructing the text, they're joint constructing the text with the teacher scaffolding. And I use this particular example here from their article to show specifically how the teacher is focusing on language. So I'll give you a second to go ahead and read that. Okay. So you can see that as the teacher is helping the student construct the text, there's an effort really to focus on the language. So in this case, it happens to be connector words, but there's other type of language that the teacher can focus on. I like to use this example this is actually from a speaking class, it's not from a writing class, from an article that Terry Pika wrote many years ago. And what she was showing was this was in a IEP class in which students, advanced IEP class where students were talking about literature and film. And the students were talking about sort of very complex ideas, but the teacher often didn't focus on language. So instead it was just focused on the students' ideas about film or about literature. And so here's an example from that particular article. And again, we understand why in a speaking class a teacher might not want to stop the student to focus on language, but the idea is that in a writing class, we can do this, okay? So students are creating written text, we can stop and help the students. Something that's a little bit harder to do in a speaking class, I think. In fact, in this particular article where Terry Pika wrote about sort of the lack of language focus in some of these content classes, she talks about some ideas for increasing a focus on language, and one of the ideas she talks about is are dictoglosses. And again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the dictogloss. If you want to read an article about some variations on a dictogloss, I've got a reference here for you. There's an article by Prince in Language Teaching Research, and he goes through different variations on this. But again, the idea is that students listen to a short text a few times and try to reconstruct it. Because they're listening for meaning, as they're reconstructing the text, they're really focused on the meaning, but then as they're writing it, they have to focus on, they have to use language, but then they can compare their text to the original, and now they're actually looking for language differences. Well, here's what the original was, here's what I said. So it's a way to sort of focus on meaning and language at the same time. So those are just some suggestions I have. I was going to stop here and see if people had other ideas of activities that worked for them, that really did focus both on language and meaning, language and content at the same time. If, or maybe you don't agree with me, maybe you think we don't need to focus on language so much. So I'll stop here and see if you have other ideas.
I've liked to use kind of the SFL teaching and learning cycle, the deconstruction and joint construction and independent construction. I like that, and the swales move analysis. I think students find that useful. As a teacher trying to use those, I've always found it difficult to, identify the language features to teach in genres that I want to teach to students, like identifying those myself,
Yeah.
can take a lot of time.
I actually love to do. I don't know. For me, it's sort of fun. Like if we go to this, like I just this week I just went. It just took me a minute to find it. So I went to this and I looked at like, okay, what kind of language features jump out at me here? And then this is what I noticed, like, oh, the study. It's interesting you said that. It's something I enjoy. Like I just love looking at this and trying to see what kind of features. What you will find, I think, that's challenging is if you, particularly with abstracts, I found if you choose 2 or 3 other ones, you're going to find they're quite different. So sometimes that's hard, trying to find, well, what language feature is the same across all of these. But that's okay, because at least particularly for advanced students, they get to sort of see the variations. So how do you, let me go to this, you said you like doing this, Ryan. Do you have any sort of suggestions for implementing the deconstruction, joint construction, and independent construction?
I'm just looking at Nigel's comments here.
Yeah.
He said about this, he says he's found that collaborative writing is an excellent way to focus on content and writing in the joint construction stage.
Yes, absolutely. What I was going to, let me use an example, a couple of things. One thing I want to say about the joint construction, I want to go back to the dictogloss example. I've done this in my MA-TESOL classes with students, and what I have found is if you give students different things to listen for when they're listening for the dictocom, and then you put them together. So, for example, one student might get a set of word or phrases that they're going to hear from the dictogloss, and another student gets another set. Then when they come together, they have different information. So the trick is, I think, in the joint constructions and collaborative writing is sort of coming up with ways to get both students to contribute. However, I don't know, maybe Nigel, if this is what you mean, is that when they're joint constructing, there is a natural tendency to focus on language. So if you look at the work by Meryl Swain or others, you find that as students, and Naomi Storch, as students are writing together, and there's several other studies out there, they actually do focus on language. So I think that is a good way to get students to focus on language. I'm reading the other comments here. In our writing assignments, yeah, okay. So in our writing classes, we use rubrics for all writing assignments, and they do include language, vocabulary, grammar. Yeah. Another, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but another possible way to get students to focus on language is have them self-assess using these rubrics, and particularly the grammar and vocabulary. So that might be another way to get the students to actually look at the language that they're using and focusing on it. Betsy said the little books from Swales and Feek are useful in pointing out the language features. Yes, absolutely. If you do a Swales analysis correctly, you do end up focusing on the language, and the books by Swales and Feek certainly do a great job of that. What happens is, I think when some people go ahead and implement a move analysis, they often don't focus on the language. So when I'm looking at these with my grad students, I'm always trying to get them, okay, let's not focus only on the moves, but let's look at the language that's in those moves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Charlene, just to come back to actually both the Swalesian analysis and the joint construction, that,
Yeah.
you know, and you're absolutely right that Meryl Swain's work and Naomi Storch's work shows that when students are in pairs, and there's some work in groups as well, that they do pay attention to language in different ways. And Swain's work is more complex because she does the reformulation, and it's very clever. What we did with joint construction, the canonical joint construction, is a teacher-led whole class joint construction. So the teacher is there to make sure that the conversation goes in certain directions. And in the research I've just finished, what I saw was that teachers paid different degrees of attention to language, but they did all pay attention to language.
Oh, great. Okay.
And they paid attention to different things. So it was fascinating because it's very much responsive to what the students are producing, and some of it is implicit, some of it is explicit, and there's different. Some of it involves meta language, some of it's just recasting, some of it's going back and editing. But there was, within an hour recording in each of these instances, there was an amazingly rich attention to both content and language, and a very fluid attention, and it seems to have an effect. So I think it's worth looking at.
Yeah, yeah. How did you, what exactly were the teachers doing? I mean, was it similar to like De Oliveri and Lon study, or they were?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit like that, except it was in an IEP setting, but it's definitely similar to Luciana's work. The key thing with joint construction, and you alluded to it before, is that there has to be a shared experience, so you have to be writing about something everyone has access to, because otherwise people bring different levels of knowledge. So it doesn't work very well with argument writing because everyone wants to make a different argument. So in this case, so we used to do it with product reviews, and it doesn't always work too well because not everyone knows the product. So in my dissertation research, we were doing house descriptions. So they had a picture of a house and a floor plan of the house, and they had to describe it as if they were writing one of these like featured home articles for a newspaper. So they were all looking at the same stuff, they'd all analyzed the same models, and they had a shared experience to write about, and that meant they could all contribute. And that you do get very broad participation, even from reluctant students. So and it seems to be that students who just observe seem to benefit too, which is interesting, although that's tentative.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's great. I can't wait to read the dissertation or an article from your dissertation. Yeah.
You don't want to read the whole thing.
I'll wait for the article, I think. Yeah. Other comments? Well, nobody talked about error correction. That's great. But what are some activities similar to dictogloss? To error. I see the dictogloss is very controlled writing. It's interesting that also, well, what other kinds of activities are similar to dictogloss? I don't know if you'd even consider this a writing activity, but even giving students sentences that they have to put in order, or another possibility would, something I've sort of tried, where you give students like the beginning and the end of a paragraph, and they have to write the middle of it. Those are sort of very controlled activities. And going back to Nigel's example that he said, jigsaw writing, yeah, that would absolutely be another kind of example. I thought it was interesting that Nigel said he actually gave the students a house to describe. I think a lot of people, which I actually agree, I actually like that idea. I think there are people out there who would say, oh yeah, but they're not writing about anything that's meaningful to them. And so it's not going to be as an authentic writing activity. However, as Nigel said, it gives people a shared experience, and they're actually trying to construct this together. So I would call that a more controlled, maybe, writing example. Other variations on dictoglosses. Again, the one I like the best is actually not discussed by Prince in his particular, in the article I mentioned. I like the one where you actually have people listening for different phrases. So I'll give half the class one set of phrases, and the other half the class a different set of phrases, and they have to get together to actually construct the dictogloss. I'm reading a few other ones. Yeah, jigsaw writing is a great activity, I think. but inauthentic may be okay for joint construction. Ryan, I'm not sure what you mean. So maybe you mean so they can actually construct they talk about the house together, the shared experience, and then they write their own independently?
Right. Well, you were saying that people might say, well, if it's not something that's meaningful personally to them, you know, they're all writing about this house that was given to them to write about. I mean, maybe it's fine for the joint construction, but then for the independent construction, they can write about something that's more meaningful to them. So they do
Absolutely.
get both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Nigel wrote, shameless self-publicity, but in the Oxford textbook series Inside Writing, each unit has a genre analysis and collaborative writing task, all of the above plus some others. Okay. Shall we end, or if no one else has any other comments?
Does anybody else have any ways that they have incorporated both content and language when they teach writing? Anything you'd like to share with the rest of us?
I think I might be preaching to the choir here, actually, sort of talking to you guys. But I think everybody so far who's commented sort of sees the value of absolutely focusing on both and really trying hard to integrate. That's sort of the trick here. I find my pre-service teachers have trouble sort of integrating the two. So those of you who are out there who I think a bunch of you are doing teacher training, I think it's really important to think about helping new teachers figure out how they can really integrate language with other aspects of writing.
Right. It's not just focusing on language and focusing on content. It's focusing how they work together, right?
Right. And this is not, you know, again, going back to Terry Pica's article, this is not an issue just for writing teachers. It's really an issue in all of language teaching. This is something that's come up in the research I've done in Spanish literature classes, where the teachers, there's very little focus on language and sort of helping students understand the literature. So I think this is really the challenge. Betsy said, I like the idea of mini lessons focused on areas of language where students are struggling. So actually, yeah. So actually sort of, so for example, after students turn in an essay, for example, looking at certain areas and then doing language lessons, Nigel says, absolutely, I see the same with our practicum students. They're given a grammar textbook and a writing textbook, which aren't aligned. Yep, and we give separate grammar and writing grades, so it's hard for them to see them as integrated. Yes, absolutely. Student, how could Corpora help us identify which language speakers to focus on? Interesting. It depends if you have I would say it depends if you have I don't know. I guess if you're talking about creating your own Corpora, or if you're talking about using something like Coca, I would say a corpora would help you only if you have a sort of a specialized corpora. So if you wanted, and actually if you wanted to do your own, they're not that hard to create. Small ones wouldn't be that hard to create. So for example, if you wanted to look at journal abstracts from TESOL Quarterly, you could go to AntConc and create your own and sort of see. It's probably easier to do for vocabulary, probably, to see kind of which verbs came up, which were the more common verbs. MyCusp is student papers, right, Ryan? So I don't know. Yeah, I don't have any good ideas right now off the top of my head because my cusp is rather, there's a very broad range of genres and topics, so I don't know how useful that would be. Nigel says, I've used my cusp with grad students for genre analysis, e.g. reports, but I choose papers for them to analyze. Okay, so it's a teacher resource to go in and find examples of specific papers. It's probably too cumbersome for students to actually go in and look themselves. Okay, well, I will end here, and I have to say again, going back to what I said at the beginning, is that I'm finding the genre to be really interesting, and particularly as the comments are coming in. I'm trying to read the comments out loud as we're talking. Okay?
Thank you very much, Charlene. We really appreciate this. And we will post the recording online once it's available.
Okay.
And, if anybody else comes up with anything afterwards that they would like to share with the rest of us about how you incorporate language and content in teaching writing, feel free to send your ideas to our e-list.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. And again, I know you guys are meeting at TESOL. Unfortunately, I won't be there, so I wish I could actually get to meet everybody, particularly people that were online today that I haven't met. So I hope your sessions at TESOL go well too. I heard there's going to be one on the 5-paragraph essay that I would love to hear. But
yeah, for anybody who's going to TESOL this year, our second language writing intersection academic session, which Nigel Kaplan organized, is on the 5 myths of the 5-paragraph essay.
I wish I could be there. Okay, all right. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me again. Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.